If you want to succeed in poker, there's one concept you absolutely cannot ignore: the ability to think in ranges. You see, most beginners, they only think about their whole cards rather than considering the entire range of hands they might be representing, and this makes you very easy to play against. In today's video, I'll show you how to transform your thought process so that you can start thinking about your entire range rather than only your hand. A range in poker simply means the hands someone is representing with their actions. If you've ever studied a solver, looked at a pre-flop chart, or done any serious poker studying at all, you will have seen a range chart like the one on the right here. This simply represents the types of hands some player can have. The problem is, even if you know what a range is, most players lack the ability to think in terms of ranges during an actual game. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to transform your thought process, and we're going to break it down step by step. 95% of the people watching this video already know what a range is, or at least they think they do. Let's test that. Here we see a heads-up strategy 100 big blinds deep. Small blind in position opens a very wide range. Action on big blind, and here's their defense. They're going to go ahead and put in a raise. Action back on us in the small blind. Here we see two strategies. On the right-hand side, it's small blind strategy facing the raise. On the left-hand side, we see a range of possible hole cards. Now, here's the question for you. What does this range on the left actually represent? I'm willing to bet that most of you said that this is big blind's 3-betting range. And if you said that, congratulations, you know how to read a solver. But I would argue that your interpretation isn't quite correct. You see, this isn't necessarily big blind's 3-betting range. This is small blind's perception of big blind's 3-betting range. This is what small blind thinks big blind is raising with. Conversely, if we go back a step, here action is on big blind, and this range on the right-hand side, well, this is big blind's perception of small blind's opening range, right? And so ranges in poker are beliefs. They are beliefs about what your opponent is representing with their actions. In theory, there is no difference between the beliefs and what they actually have in GTO land, in a solver. But in practice, there is a big difference. And we're going to dive into why that matters and how to think about ranges like a pro. Let's back up to one of the most ancient concepts. In 1999, David Sklansky introduced the concept of leveling in poker. A leveling war goes like this. The very first level is to ask, what cards do I have? It's the most basic beginner level. Level 2 asks, okay, but what does my opponent have? Okay, but what do they think that I have? All right, but what do they think I think they have? And you can go on and on like this. There are infinite levels. Back in the day, poker players thought that in order to succeed, you had to outlevel your opponent. You had to be one step ahead of them in the leveling war. As time progressed, we came to understand that if you run this leveling war to infinity, you end up with GTO, a Nash equilibrium strategy where neither player has any more incentive to improve or change what they're doing. Now, let me give you a simple example of a level in poker. Imagine a scenario where you believe your opponent is bluffing. The reason you think they're bluffing is because you know that they think you're weak. So you make a call with a really light marginal bluff catcher. This is an example of a level. You're weak, they know you're weak, you know that they know you're weak, and you go one step ahead and call with a really marginal bluff catcher, right? That's one example, but it gets a lot more complex from there. Now, personally, I don't think you need an infinite number of levels. I think that this can be summarized with only 3 levels. So let me put a new spin on this old concept. Very first level is still your hand. And here I want to ask, what are my hand's incentives? So in particular, does this hand want to build stacks? Does it want to get as much money in the pot as possible? Or do I want a cheap showdown? Do I want to try and realize my equity, pot control, etc.? Or is my hand just garbage that wants to get out of the way as soon as possible, or perhaps bluff my opponent, right? So identify your hand's incentives. The next level is to ask about your opponent's range. What is your opponent representing with their actions? And this is key. How can you even begin to assess the strength of your own hand without thinking about their range? After all, your hand is only as strong as your opponent's range is weak. And this is why it's critical to be at least a level 2 player. Then level 3 is to think about your own range. And this is to ask, what hands am I representing with my actions, right? So this is asking about your opponent's perception of your range. Another way to put this is to imagine it as your table image. Level 3 is your own table image. So if you are a splashy loose player, people are going to believe that you're quite wide, and they're maybe more likely to pay you off, but also more likely to call your bluffs. Conversely, if you're a very tight player, players would view you as kind of a nit. They're less likely to pay you off, but also more likely to fold to a bluff. And so the idea of table image, leveling, ranges, they're all saying the same thing. It all describes beliefs. Ranges are beliefs. When you make a bet, you're representing a range of hole cards, and everything in poker comes down to how the actions you take represent some range of cards. The same is true for your opponent. Their range represents your beliefs about their holdings. Therefore, if you want to understand poker strategy beyond a beginner level, you need to start thinking about ranges and how those ranges change with certain actions, rather than just concentrating on your hand's incentives. But don't take my word for it. Here's legendary game theorist Noam Brown, the developer of Pluribus and Libretus, talking about what ranges actually mean in poker.
In poker, you have to reason about beliefs. And so the value of a state depends on the beliefs that players have about what the different cards are. Like if you have pocket aces, then whether that's a really, really good hand or just an okay hand depends on whether you know I have pocket aces. Right? Like if you know that I have pocket aces, then if I bet, you're going to fold immediately. But if you think that I have a really bad hand, then I could bet with pocket aces and make a ton of money. So the value function in poker these days takes the beliefs as an input.
What if your beliefs are wrong, though? What if you believe your opponent's range looks this way, but it actually looks that way? Well, this is the allure of playing a GTO strategy. It doesn't actually matter if you guess wrong if you're playing GTO, because GTO is the strongest possible fixed strategy. However, if you're playing an exploitative strategy, then it matters a lot. If your beliefs, if your perceptions about their range are incorrect, you could be torching money or accidentally making more money. Let me give you an example. Button opens, you defend in the big blind, and the flop comes 4-4-3 rainbow. This is a spot where you're supposed to check most of your range to the aggressor. And here, when checked to, the button is supposed to bet for a medium size quite often, or for a smaller size a little more often. When they bet, you're supposed to be check raising aggressively with quite a merged range. As you can see, there's a lot of money flying into the pot quite quickly. But what if our assumptions are wrong? What if button is kind of passive? So let's change our beliefs about what button is doing here. The way I'm going to do this is through the node locking feature. I'll set their frequency such that they check back the flop quite often, and we'll lock that in place. Now, since Big Blind now believes that button is playing too passively, they decide to lead a good portion of their range. And the reason for this is twofold. First of all, imagine you have a hand like trips here that was excited to get a big fat check raise in. Well, that's not really going to happen very often anymore because button is just checking back most of the time now. And secondly, a lot of your medium strength hands, say your ace high and king high, they were afraid that if you lead too much, then these hands will get blasted out of the pot or get a lot of pressure put on them. You don't want to cap your range too early out of position because if you do so, you can't represent anything strong, and therefore your opponent might punish you with aggression. But since button is being super passive, that threat is gone. They're not going to punish you on the flop. They're just going to check back most of the time, and therefore it's safe to cap your range to some degree. Now keep in mind that again, this is based on our belief that button is being too passive. This is our belief that we've modeled, we've forced the computer to play this way. But this isn't necessarily how they're playing, right? So first thing I want to do is just compare the expected value before and after. At the top here, we can see that the big blind's expected value was 2.04 chips in the GTO simulation here. This is GTO. And it is now 2.18 chips when We node lock our assumptions in and then maximally exploit the mistakes that we think they're making. But what if we are wrong? What if we assume they're too passive, but they're actually too aggressive? Well, let's try another experiment. I'm going to now lock in our new strategy where we like to lead the flop quite often. So let's lock all this in place. And button, I will unlock. And so by unlocking them, I'm allowing them to change their strategy based on the belief that we're donking too often. So they can now adjust this range however they see fit. We'll continue, and we'll see what happens. And now, knowing that our checking range is too weak, they just start betting any two cards for a medium size, and we have little to no defense against it, forced to fold a lot of very strong or medium strength hands here, and we lose the expected value with most of our range. If we go back again, comparing EV at the root node, and I'll click this compare nodes button, we can see that our expected value compared to the last one has dropped from 2.18 down to 1.81. And if we compare that to the original GTO strategy, it's still a pretty significant loss. So that's the problem with exploitative strategies. If you're correct, you can win some, but you can always lose a lot too. And the allure of playing GTO is that if we just go back to the original GTO strategy, then it doesn't actually matter if button is playing too aggressively or too passively. Their mistakes can only benefit us. In a heads-up pot, in particular in a zero-sum game, your opponent's mistakes can only benefit you, or it'll keep your EV the same. So regardless of what button does here, big blind's expected value will only stay the same or increase. That brings us to Chapter 2, Range Morphology. What is this pretentious word, you ask? Morphology is just the study of shapes or structures, so the study of the shape of your range. You see, when you first start studying with solvers, you're going to run into a problem. There are way too many different hole cards. You cannot possibly keep track of all of that information. So what good players do instead is they think about ranges as shapes and structures. We have various words to describe these shapes: capped, uncapped, polarized, linear, condensed, merged. And each of these different range shapes has certain strategies and ideas associated with them. So the easiest way to get started with ranges is by learning range morphology. The simplest description we can give to a range is whether or not it's capped. This chart represents your hand strength along the y-axis. So an uncapped range contains nutted hands. It contains all of the strongest hands, and you can represent the nuts. A capped range does not contain these hands, so there is a cap on the hand strength you can represent, hence the word capped. Doing a comparison, you can describe an uncapped range as one that contains the nuts, or very strong hands. When you have an uncapped range, you generally want to play aggressively. As an example, your button opening range can represent pocket aces. Therefore, it is uncapped. Conversely, a capped range is one that does not contain the nuts, and you want to play capped ranges defensively against uncapped opponents. For example, when big blind calls the button open, their calling range does not contain ace-ace because they would have raised that pre-flop. Therefore, they cannot represent that type of hand. What about the more complex poker jargon? Well, there's only really 4 terms you need to know: polarized, linear, condensed, and merged. In the following slides, I have these little hand strength examples. The bottom here in red represents your weakest hands. The top represents your strongest hands. Let's start with linear. It's the easiest one to understand of these 4. A linear range means it's representing top-down uncapped range. As you can see, we have the strongest hands, we have some medium hands, and a few of the weaker hands. So when you have a linear range, typically the bottom is chopped off. You'll want to try and pot control the middle while building the pot with the top of your range. You always start with a linear range. So for example, if you take a look at any, like a button opening range, or any opening range for that matter, it is by definition linear because you simply open the best hands and fold the worst. So it is a top-down uncapped range. This is your starting point. You always start with a linear range, and then you can construct your strategy from there. Next, we have a polarized range, and polarity is the most important range morphology to understand because it's how you get value in poker. A polarized range is one that represents very strong hands and bluffs. When you have a polarized range, your goal is to build the pot. You want to play aggressively, you want to use big bet sizes, and you want to try and leverage your bluffs using those big sizes. An example of a polarized range would be betting in position on the river. When you're in position on the river, you have the option to check back. You don't typically want to bet medium strength hands in position on the river, you just want to check those back and go to showdown. You want to bet strong hands that want to get value, and you want to bet some bluffs that want to make the opponent fold. You don't have much incentive to bet the middle. The opposite side of this is a condensed range, or a depolarized range. This represents medium hands, so maybe you have some stronger and weaker, but the majority of your range is representing medium strength stuff. When you have a condensed range, your goal is to play defensively. You're playing for a cheap showdown, you want to pot control, you're playing a bluff catching game. So this is the opposite, right? If your opponent is polarized, you are by definition condensed. An example of a condensed range is calling a river bet, right? When your opponent bets on the river and you call, you're calling with precisely medium strength hands. You would raise your strongest hands that want to get value, and you might raise some bluffs or fold those bluffs, but the calling range is by definition medium strength, right? Of course, it doesn't have to be on the river. Condensed ranges exist pre-flop and on the flop and turn, but this is the most obvious example. Next, we have the most complicated one, and this is merged. A merged range can be thought of as a semi-polarized range. We have some strong hands, we have some weak hands, but we also representing a little bit of medium strength stuff. Polarity exists on a spectrum. A perfectly polar range would be the stone cold nuts and a pure bluff, whereas a perfectly condensed range would only have medium strength hands. But the truth is that poker is more complicated than one or the other extreme. Things can happen in the middle. So why do merged ranges exist? Well, when you have a merged range, you typically want to use a smaller bet and raise size because you're trying to get thin value with your medium to strongish hands. You're still going to have some nutted hands in there, and the top of your range protects the rest of your medium strength hands. The key is that sometimes in poker, you can bet a medium strength hand that folds out better and simultaneously gets called by worse. This is the sweet spot. Normally, the opposite happens. When you bet a medium strength hand, you typically get called by better hands and fold out hands you already beat. But sometimes the opposite scenario exists, and that is why a merged strategy works sometimes. Chapter 3. When your range does not matter. This may seem like an odd thing to include. After all, haven't I just spent the entire video telling you when ranges matter and here's why and how you should think about ranges? Well, yes, but I wanted to show you a thought experiment that changed the way I thought about poker. Consider this question. Why does your own range affect your strategy? For example, if you have a hand like tens, why do you care what you could have had in that spot? Why do you care that, you could have gotten here with aces or seven deuce or a flush or a gut shot? What does it matter? You have tens here and now. Who cares what you could have had? Why would that impact your strategy with this particular hand? Take a moment to consider this question. Why does your range affect the strategy with your hand? Well, I'll explain it to you the way Don Corleone explained it to me many years ago. Your range influences how your opponent should play. If you were to change your range, they should change their strategy. And when they change their strategy, that changes the expected value of your hand in consequence. Remember, a range is your opponent's belief. Your range represents what they believe you have. So, if you change their belief about the hands you could have, they play a different way. A common example might be you hold the nuts, but most of your range is really weak, so you expect your opponent to bet quite often. Therefore, you should slow play because you expect them to bet often. A different example might be you hold the nuts, but your range is very strong. Your opponent believes that your range is very strong, and therefore your opponent will play passively. In this case, you should not slow play the nuts, you should do the betting, because they're probably just going to check back if you check to them, right? And so this is what it means when your own range influences your strategy. Let's quickly return to this example, and I want you to take a note of the nuts. 8-8. This is a hand that's supposed to check 40% of the time, bet 60% of the time. But this is built under the assumption that big blind believes when we check, we're representing all of these hands. And when we bet, we're representing all of these hands. So our 8-8 is disguised among all of the hands we could have. Now, of course, if we change this, if we try and model just our exact hand, right? If we get rid of all of this and say, you know what? The only hand I want to plug into small blind is 8-8 because that's the only hand I actually had. So why do I care about the rest of the hands? Well, what you're actually telling the solver in this case is that this is the only hand you could have. And so it's the equivalent in terms of plugging into a solver of turning your hand face up. It's like flopping quads and just showing your opponent immediately. And of course you bet and they just fold everything. They can't actually have these hands. We block them, but you get the point, right? Like, this is why you need to represent an entire range of beliefs in a solver. You can't just plug in a single hand because you have to model the beliefs about all of the different hands that could have gotten there. Going back to the GTO simulation here, where 8s is supposed to be betting 60% of the time, we can try some different experiments. So we've seen what happens if we plug in only our whole cards. What if we change the assumption? What if we assign a range of any two cards? And what this actually represents is we're saying big blind believes we're super wide. We just open any two. Well, if we do that, we can see that 8-8 bets a lot less often, checking almost 90% of the time. And the reason for this is that if our opponent believes we're weak, they're more likely to bet when we check to them. And therefore, your strong hands have more incentive to check because they want to get bet into, right? And you can do the opposite experiment as well. What if big blind perceives us as a rather tight player? So rather than having just 8-8, I'll plug in like a very strong range here. Something like this. Now, this isn't a realistic small blind opening range by any means, but just to demonstrate our point here, if you have a very tight range, well, you can start leading a lot more often because now your opponent is going to be afraid of what you're representing. You can represent a lot of very strong hands. And also, if you check, well, they know your range is still pretty strong, so you're not going to get as much money in. And so, of course, 8-8, along with every other hand in your range, just starts leading. Now consider this question. What if their strategy is static? What if your opponent does not change their strategy based on your range? They just play the same way with the same hands in this spot always. They don't care what you're representing. They're just playing this strategy. A GTO strategy is static. By definition, it is a fixed strategy. So if you're playing like a GTO bot, for example, it doesn't even think about, you could have this hand or that hand. It's just playing a fixed strategy. In this case, it doesn't change. So your range affects your strategy if and only if villain is dynamic, if they are capable of adapting to new beliefs about what you're representing. Okay, here's a quick example. This is a toy game spot 2-2-2-3-3, where both players have queens, kings, or aces. In this spot, the correct strategy is just to check everything. And when we check, they're supposed to bet their aces, bluff their queens, and check back their kings. Now, question to you, what would happen if in this spot we got rid of our kings and our queens and we only had aces? And at the same time, what would happen if big blind didn't react, if they were static, didn't change their strategy to adapt to the fact that we're now more nutted? Well, let's find out. All right, so here we can see I've only given small blind aces, and I've locked big blind to play the exact same strategy that they were before. Again, checking back kings, always betting aces, and bluffing queens half the time. And we can see that despite the fact that we only have the best possible hand, we're supposed to always check. And the reason I'm showing you this is that you need to come away from this video understanding that the reason your own range affects your own strategy is because of how your opponent is supposed to adjust to your range. In this case, ace-ace was checking before, and it's checking now, and in both cases the reason for that is that big blind is playing the same way, right? If we start betting, well, we can only get action from ace-ace, but if we check, we can actually get some money from queens as well. So keep in mind that when you're playing against static type opponents, you don't need to think about your range as much. You don't need to think about your table image as much. You can just try and maximize your hand against that particular player archetype. And so I actually think this thought experiment is one of the most important in poker that you can think about. I don't have time to cover all of that in depth now, but I'll link an article in the description that you can check out. In summary, thinking in ranges is crucial to your poker development. At the end of the day, ranges are beliefs, and the reason you have to use them is because the way you should play depends on your beliefs about what your opponent could be holding, and the way they should play depends on their beliefs about what you could be holding. And so you have to move on from thinking of whole cards to ranges if you really want to progress as a poker player. And the easiest way to do this is to think of ranges as structures rather than thinking of each combination individually. Is your range polarized, merged, condensed, and so on? Thinking of them as structures and finding out the strategies associated with those structures is one of the fastest ways to progress as a GTO player. Lastly, you need to understand the feedback cycle when your range matters and when it does not. You need to understand that the way that you play is a function of your opponent's strategy, and their strategy ought to be a function of the type of hands you can represent of your range. But if that cycle is broken, if your opponent will not adapt, then your range stops mattering, and you can just try to maximize your whole cards against that player's particular strategy. There's plenty more to learn about. I've covered some of this in previous topics, so I'll put some links in the description if you want to cover any of these topics in further detail. If you're still curious, make sure to leave a comment or join our Discord server. We're happy to answer questions. Anyway, that's my video, guys. I hope you liked it. I hope you got something out of it. If you found this valuable, please hit the like and subscribe button. It really does help us out. And as always, happy grinding.